Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker. You know, shame can be debilitating, and we hide behind a mask so that no one knows what we're really going through. No matter what the cause of your shame, our next guest says you can overcome it. You can overcome it. Joining us for part two of Overcoming Shame is Dr. Mark Baker. Dr. Baker received a PhD in clinical psychology and a master's degree in theology, as well as a certificate in psychodynamic psychotherapy. He serves as the executive director of the Levy Counseling Centers in Pasadena and Santa Monica, California. He's the author of several books, including Jesus, the Greatest Therapist Who Ever Lived, which has more than 2 million copies in print. Here to tell us the story and continue with the dialogue on overcoming shame, let go of others' expectation, and embrace God's acceptance is our friend, Dr. Mark Baker. Dr. Baker, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you. It's good to be with you again.
This issue of shame causes us to wear a mask where we can't be real.
It does. It's a terrible problem for all of us. Everyone has, to some degree, an issue with shame. It's a matter of degree. We all feel it, but no one wants to talk about it. It's an emotion that makes us want to withdraw and hide. And so it's very difficult for us to deal with shame in our lives because the very feeling of shame itself makes us want to withdraw, makes us want to go into hiding. I've been working at a Christian counseling center for decades, and I kept seeing in my office good people, godly people coming into my office, people who attend church on a regular basis, who pray together, who read the Bible together, and yet they were plagued with psychological problems that kept showing itself in secret ways, in addictions and in anger outbursts and abusive relationships that were all hidden out of sight. And as we would drill down into how this could be happening, how could godly people struggle with these kinds of issues, marriages would break up, all kinds of problems, I would find consistently at the core of these pathologies, of these problems, was a chronic feeling of shame. And as I just said, the very nature of shame is that it wants to hide, so it's very difficult for us to get our hands around it and press into it and figure out how to solve it, because it makes us want to not admit that it's even there. And we would put on a mask, maybe sometimes a mask of spirituality or of super spirituality, in order to hide from this feeling of shame, and then it doesn't get solved. And we now know, we've got psychological research now that we know that chronic feelings of shame are connected to all kinds of psychological problems. And so that drove me to write this book. We of all people need to root this out so that we can live the lives that God has intended us to live.
How would we clinically define the word shame?
Good. It's where we need to start. A big problem is that we use the words guilt and shame interchangeably. We do because, sadly, a lot of psychological research is not clear in this area. Freud wrote a lot about guilt, and now as we look back into the writings of Freud, we see that he was really talking about shame, but he didn't make the distinction between guilt and shame, and many psychological authors haven't up until the last, about decade. About the last 10 years, we've made this distinction. The difference is simple. Guilt is about what you do, shame is about who you are. Guilt is I feel bad because I have done something I should not do. And guilt without shame, a healthy guilt, makes me want to make amends. So guilt makes me want to go out. If I hurt you and I've done something to offend you, healthy guilt makes me want to go make that right. Makes me want to leave my gift at the altar and go and seek you out and say, you know what, I really regret what I said last week. I don't know where my head was at, but that thing that I said, I'm so sorry I said that. That's healthy guilt. Guilt, we now know, we've done lots of psychological research in this area, is healthy. People who experience guilt have a conscience, and it motivates them to make things right. You do something wrong, you can do something about that wrong, you can seek forgiveness, right? Shame is about who you are. Shame is not just a bad feeling for having done something wrong. Shame is a bad feeling for being something wrong. Now you begin to doubt your worth. Shame is believing the lie that you are not fearfully and wonderfully made. Shame is believing the lie that you are not worthy of love. And that makes me want to hide. It makes me then act out in bad ways. If I believe I'm defective and have this painful feeling of worthlessness about myself that I don't want to talk about, then I'm going to start acting out of that place and then doing things that are congruent with my belief about myself, which is someone who's not worthy of love. So shame is about who you are. Guilt is about what you do. Guilt is basically healthy when it's free of shame, and shame is unhealthy and leads to lots of psychological problems.
Are we looking at the difference between what we might call conviction and condemnation?
Yeah. Right.
Conviction being, I feel that in the pit of my belly that I might have said something or done something wrong, and I need to make amends for it. Condemnation is a brush which I'm painted with, where I am cut off. I am actually condemned, and because I'm condemned, I may be like that death row inmate. I've been judged and condemned, and I'm unworthy of redemption. So I'm on death row. The end has already been determined. There's no rehabilitation. There's no salvation. There's no redemption. I've given up almost in a hopeless state, and therefore it's all consuming. And that's what I kind of consider to be condemnation. And of course, the Bible tells us that God will convict, but God does not condemn.
Right.
But we lose sight of that.
Right. That's absolutely right. And we do lose sight of that because it's hard to hold those two things in tension. Those are different. And when we do things that we regret and keep doing them because we're all sinners and we're flawed, it's hard to hold that intention. No, wait, I am a creature created in the image of God. I don't deserve love because you can't earn it, but I am worthy of it because of how I am made. I am made in the image of God, so I am worthy of love. And it's hard to hold on to that belief, that realization that there is no condemnation in Christ Jesus, that I am worthy of God's love, even though I still fail, even though I still do things for which I feel guilty, and I need to ask for forgiveness. I need to continue to ask for forgiveness, believing that I'm worthy of love in the midst of my fallen nature. It is hard to hold those intentions. So people slip over into this chronic feeling of, oh, I'm really not worthy of love. I can't apologize to that person because I'm the kind of person who keeps hurting people, so I don't even deserve forgiveness. We fall into that pit that causes us to spiral down and into all kinds of other psychological problems that don't lead to health. They don't lead to health.
In today's society, we look at this issue of being shamed. It turns shame into a verb. It is an action. In many cases, it's intentional. It is painting somebody and portraying them in a light which is to force them to be marked by shame, identified by shame, and it's quite intentional, and it's now a new weapon in the arsenal that people are using to advance an agenda of condemnation,
right.
Imposing it upon you, where I might not have felt that way until someone did this, said this, acted upon me in such a way that now I feel ashamed. Right. And I'm now struggling with the shame. I think the Brett Kavanaugh hearing was a perfect example of that, was that there was an intention, it was deliberate, it was intentional to shame this man for an implied behavior that could not be verified, but nevertheless, his family suffered 5 weeks of incredible shame that will always be associated with his name, that can never go away.
Right. I think you're exactly right. It's become weaponized, as they say, and this is a tragedy that that for really political reasons, or for, as you say, reasons of having an agenda, we are now using this very devastating and destructive uh, feeling of chronic shame as a weapon against other people. And the way our society is built now, social media will allow someone to humiliate someone else and to intentionally shame them. And they can do so easily. They can do it from their computer in their bedroom. They can create great devastation by attempting to shame someone's character and to use it as a weapon. Shame is a damaging emotion when it's used in that way. And our society is spinning in a very dangerous direction when it is actually responding to people who are using shame in this way in positive ways. People are listening to, and the Kavanaugh hearings is a good example. I see this all the time. I'm aware of a man who is a Christian man who's put together an acting company that he's really trying to do a good thing, and it happens to be an all-male cast because he's trying to do what Shakespeare actually did. You know, the original cast were all male, right? So he was trying to recreate this and this art form, and now he's receiving all kinds of criticism because there's no women on his cast, right? And there's a particular woman who's trying to publicly shame him for not having any women in his cast. And he keeps saying, but wait a minute, I'm just trying to, in this particular play, recreate what Shakespeare did. It's an artistic statement here. And she's trying to humiliate him as a misogynist because there's no women on the cast, completely distorting his intentions, completely taking out of context what he's trying to do, because she has a political agenda to shame him in public. It breaks my heart to see people use this very, very damaging emotion for political reasons to create damage in other people's lives, and attributing to them intentions that are not there. So yes, this has become a big problem for us in our society, and I think we all need to take a hard look at the damage we're causing by shaming other people for political reasons. And that damage will last, in some cases, a lifetime, in some cases. So I think we really need to take seriously the damage we're causing in an attempt to put forward political agendas.
Dr. Baker, why is it that so many are so willing to believe these kind of accusations? We look at a stellar 30-plus year on the bench character of Brett Kavanaugh.
Right.
We see a family that's intact, that is a beautiful family, a loving, devoted wife. We see that he had interactions with women at every level, and there were 50 women that signed a letter that said he conducted himself as a gentleman. Why? What is it about human nature that says that even though I have no indication whatsoever that this person is even capable of such a heinous act, why is it that I lean towards believing it rather than challenging my own understanding? And I have to admit that I was the victim of this 5.5 years ago. I was accused of something that I was incapable of doing, and actually was exonerated from it because I had video evidence to prove that I did not do it. But nevertheless, there were people who were willing to believe, and they had no indication whatsoever in the years that I served them. And I wound up stepping down from the pulpit and leaving the congregation because there were enough people that wanted to believe that it was true. And rather than let the evidence and all the proof speak for itself, they immediately went to a guilty, and it's true, we've gone to this environment that although our Constitution, our laws, our rule of law is innocent until proven guilty, our human nature is guilty. If there's smoke, there's fire. There must be some truth to it, because why would they say it if it wasn't true? And we seem to lean towards believing it and not believing it. And this is so destructive.
Very.
And it's a reflection of the brokenness of the receiver, not of the brokenness of the person who's been accused of it, but we're looking societally at a very broken moral compass.
You're absolutely right. And I think that the simple answer is that shame seeks to hide itself. So we all feel it. None of us want to admit it, that we feel it. We all doubt our worthiness from time to time. It goes up and down. And so if something comes along where you or someone who I have felt is above reproach, it seems like your character is good, and I've believed that, and someone suggests, oh no, he's not. There's some flaw there. There's some defect there. Because I feel that way about myself, then I want to believe that's true about you. So I'm drawn to that. I don't want to admit my own shame. I want to say, oh, he probably does do wrong things because I feel that way about myself, and I don't want to admit that. So we project that onto particularly public figures. So that's why the Kavanaugh thing just went like a wildfire, because we want to believe that our justices are above reproach and they should live by a higher standard. Someone comes along and suggests that his moral character is flawed, and because all of us struggle with that feeling of shame ourselves, it ignites a fire inside of us to be tempted to believe it's true about him. And without foundation, this is a psychological problem. It's not logical. I mean, he was a virgin during the time he was accused of accosting this woman. And yet the facts didn't matter. People were drawn to project their own doubts about their self onto him because he's a public figure. There's another element here that fame is something that we all create, right? So someone who's in the public eye, we view them in a way different than we view ourselves. And it meets a kind of a need that we have. We have a God-instilled need to idealize. We're looking for God. We all are. So we tend to, in human relationships, need to look up to and respect our leaders, right? But fame itself is a distortion of that. Fame is, there are certain people that we attribute qualities to just because they're famous, like actors. We think they should know about politics just because they're actors, right? And what that is, and I've been around famous people and in settings where famous people are there, and everybody changes. Everybody treats them differently. Why are you now acting and speaking differently about this person? It's because it ignites shame in us. You're in the spotlight, you're famous. I need to believe something as special is true about you, because in that moment, it medicates me against my own shame, my doubts about myself. So that's another element to this, is that just because someone is in the public eye, that triggers feelings of shame in us. I need to believe that there are people who are perfect because I know I'm not. And so we attribute qualities to famous people that they don't have, because it's a distortion of that need to look for the ideal God in us. When we look towards humans as sort of small g gods, that magnifies this whole dynamic. Suffice it to say that our society is not dealing with this well at all. And I think we really need to face our own doubts about our own selves and our feelings of shame, or else we're going to continue to attack other people for any hint of imperfection, particularly people in public, people in the public eye. That intensifies that need to hide our own shame by then attacking or idolizing others. It's really a cancer that's in our society today.
So shame, in one respect, is stimulated by relativity. It's related to another person, and as I try to measure myself against that other person, I feel less than, and therefore I feel shame because I don't measure up to them, and my standard needed to be Jesus, not Madonna, and we find ourselves struggling for what it is we should measure up to, and since the world is so shifting, we can't measure up to a shifting target, a moving target, when actually, as Bible-believing Christians, and I preface it by saying Bible-believing because not all Christians are Bible-believing, unfortunately, but Bible-believing Christians are pretty clear about what the mark is, and
Right.
the mark is to walk that path, the way. Jesus says, I am the way, so that's the way that we are supposed to walk, and even then, we can still become the victim of shaming, but I don't find myself struggling with a great deal of shame. I've reconciled with God. He's the one that's forgiven me, and therefore I sometimes find that those who struggle with this issue of shame falls into the inability to forgive themselves, and therefore they put Jesus back up on the cross and place themselves above him, because if Jesus forgives me and I can't forgive myself, am I not putting myself above him? And is that not rooted in pride? And then I've got this shame-pride conflict going on, and I can never get out of that because that's a vortex.
Right. That's an interesting way of putting it, but you're right. I believe the hardest person to forgive is yourself. I think that's accurate. We get caught up in this feeling of shame that wants to hide, and it blocks us from seeking forgiveness for guilt, right? So shame is a toxic quicksand that we fall into. Shame comes from broken relationship, the chronic feelings of shame. I spell this out in my book. Shame is a feeling, and it's a bad feeling you have when negative circumstances have come about. And it's hard to distinguish the feeling of guilt and shame because they feel a lot alike. So we get confused. But shame, like I said, is the bad feeling about myself, that I'm an unworthy person of love, and it spirals down, and it attaches itself to the belief that, in fact, you cannot be forgiven because of how defective you are. And now that's different from guilt, which is I feel bad and I still hold the belief that I can seek forgiveness for this. I can be forgiven if I ask for it, right? So it comes, oftentimes feelings of shame come through abuse, neglect. As a child is growing up, if they're mistreated by the people who are supposed to care for them, then it's easy to develop the belief, well, if I'm being abused by the person who's supposed to love me, then I must not be lovable. So that's often where it comes, through abusive behavior. But shame can also come just from the absence of response. If my parents were just unresponsive to me, if they were neglectful in the sense that they were there, but they just didn't communicate affection, they didn't communicate love, you can also then develop the feeling that I'm not worthy of it just because I never heard it. And that's even more insidious, where people said, well, they'll come to my office and they'll say, well, I had a fine childhood. My both parents never got divorced. But then as we dig into it, I find they were never held. Father never said, I love you. There were gaping holes in what he needed in order to feel lovable. And so he developed the feeling of shame that way. So shame comes from a brokenness in relationship, and shame is then healed in relationship. It requires us to have three things to heal shame: the courage to admit that you feel it, because we all don't want to admit it; then the vulnerability to confess that to God and to others; and then the third thing, and this is the thing that heals shame, is the experience of grace. That's what heals it. Shame cannot be healed with reason alone. You cannot reason your way out of this experience of unworthiness and defectiveness. You need to have another experience that trumps it, that changes how you experience yourself. And that's not a thought. It is a visceral experience. And it's the visceral experience of grace, psychologically we call it acceptance, that changes us. So I admit that I feel these feelings, I confess that I feel these feelings, and then I experience grace in the midst of my brokenness. That's what heals us. That's what heals us. Now, obviously, when we come to God, His grace heals us. That's the most powerful form of healing of our shame, is experiencing that relationship with God. But we need to live in grace-filled relationships after we come to Christ in order to sustain that sort of antidote to shame in our lives, or it'll come back. I know many Bible-believing Christians who struggle with shame because they are not living in grace-filled relationships, and they're not confessing and sharing their feelings of shame with God, where they can experience the healing grace that's available for all of us. So it comes from brokenness in relationship, and it's healed in relationship, first with God and then with others. And we're all in need of that renewing of our mind that goes on constantly in grace-filled relationships with God and each other.
Amen. Amen. Jesus came to bind up the brokenhearted and set the captives free. And if you're captive to shame, you have a broken heart. That's exactly what Jesus came to do, was to set you free. And in the pages of Overcoming Shame, Dr. Mark Baker tells you and shows you how to let go of others' expectation and embrace God's acceptance. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about resentment, jealousy, envy. We're going to talk about narcissism. We're going to talk about how you can navigate through this battle that's between your soul, which is where your shame is felt, and your spirit, where grace is received, and how we can get those two to line up. We'll be back with Dr. Baker after these announcements. Shalom. I'm the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, Executive Director of Igniting a Nation and host of the daily TV program Revealing the Truth, seen live every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. Central Standard Time at www.ianbn.com, and then replayed throughout the day and night via our website. All of our segments can be seen on the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel. Since our launch in January of this year, we've expanded our global reach to over 54 countries with a social media following of over 125,000. Our commitment is to bring you the most in-depth interviews with authors, subject matter experts, and thought leaders from around the world. We have interviewed guests from Israel, Brazil, England, India, and all across North America. All of our authors are featured on the Books and Media page on our website, www.ianbn.com. There you can find a direct link to the book you want to order, and we receive a small commission directly from Amazon. There is no cost to you for this service. In addition to our daily teachings and interviews, we make available to you the archive of all of the interviews on our YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram channels. Our live program is available from our homepage, and there is never a charge to you for any of this access. We made the decision long ago that we would remain a commercial-free resource that would not be influenced by any pressure from any outside company. There are only two ways that we are able to continue to operate this ministry and provide you with the only live 4-hour daily Christian television talk show program. The first is through your support and tax-deductible contributions to Igniting a Nation. These can be made directly through the donate button on the website or sent through the mail to Igniting a Nation, 2700 Corporate Drive, Suite 120, Birmingham, Alabama, 35242. The other way we support the program is by offering you a unique opportunity to have access to over 10 years worth of teachings on a subscription basis. The teaching archives contains all of my prior sermons, Torah studies, prophecy in the news videos, and much more for the low subscription price of $5 per month. This subscription grants you unlimited access to over 800 hours of content not available elsewhere and is updated weekly with the most current prophecy classes. In addition to 20 hours of original TV programming each weekday, we invite you to join us live every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday evenings for our Prophecy in the News classes. The times and locations are listed on our events page on the website www.ianbn.com. Every day, you and I are faced with the challenge of where we will go to hear the truth. We are committed to bring you the only program of its kind that covers the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. We cannot do this without your support. Since we launched on January 5th, 2017, we have aired over 300 individual teachings, interviews, and commentaries not available anywhere else. We are now working side by side with almost every major Christian publishing house to bring you the most in-depth feature interviews possible. Our one-hour features address every subject that affects the believer's life. We are hearing of salvations from the Middle East, Africa, and all across the United States. Lives are being changed every day, and we have only just begun. Our mission is to become your trusted resource and grant you access to the people, tools, and information you need to grow in your relationship with the Lord. You can help us by liking us on social media and through your financial support. We know you have many choices in who you support, but we are prayerfully asking you to consider helping us keep revealing the truth, true to our calling, to cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth like no other program available. Donate today and help us bring the message to the four corners of the earth. Visit www.ianbn.com and donate, buy a book, or subscribe to our teaching archives. Without you, and biblical truth. I'm your host, the Reverend Rabbi Eric Walker, and we're talking part 2 with Dr. Mark Baker on overcoming shame, let go of others' expectations, and embrace God's acceptance. Dr. Baker, welcome back to Revealing the Truth.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
You know, we during break, we kind of summed it up this way, as the Bible tells us that all of our righteousness is like filthy rags before the Lord. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that none are good, no, not one. Every inclination of man's heart is evil, man is wicked beyond all else, and we tend to, in the shame continuum, we put a period at the end of those statements. And we say, okay, we're unworthy, we are worthless, unlovable, we are just stumbling, bumbling through life in this broken state. And you and I look at it and say, well, that would be fine if there was a period at the end of that sentence, but there's not a period, there's a comma. And after the comma comes the two words that nullify all of the rest of that, and those two words are, but God. But God sent his only begotten Son, that whomsoever would believe in him would have forgiveness, would have eternal life, and that, yes, it's true that all of this stuff is the way it is, but God knew that and has provided for you, and if you will receive that, then your period turns to a comma, and your life changes to a life of hope and not a life of shame.
Absolutely. And to be fair to the people who are good people living in shame, it is hard to grasp what you're saying. It's because it's an experience. It's not just an intellectual thought.
Right.
It's experiencing the grace of God. It's the comma, but God, that we experience grace in the midst of our brokenness, in the midst of our limitations, in the midst of our sin. We experience God's grace, and that's what heals our shame. And that's what allows us to be humble and yet feel worthy of love at the same time. I've spent quite a bit of time at the largest maximum security prison in the United States in Angola, Louisiana. And I've talked with men who have lived shame-filled lives, who've murdered other people with their own hands. And I have seen men transformed when they experience that comma, but God. I have done things that I've talked to men who said, I've done things that make me, I deserve death because of what I've done. Comma, but God loved me. And I've sat across the table from men who have been transformed into kind, loving, thoughtful Christian men because they experience God's grace in the midst of the horrible brokenness of their lives. The last time I was there, I had many meetings with men who were there, life in prison for murder, with no guards around at all, because I was completely safe being with a transformed man, because that comma, but God, loved him and transformed him with the grace of God. His shame was healed. They need no longer to do horrendous acts because they have no shame. They're acting out of. So you're right. It is difficult, but it is entirely possible for the grace of God to heal us of our shame. I've seen it. I've seen it.
Well, we look at the life of David Berkowitz, son of Sam.
Yep.
Here he is on consecutive life in prison terms that without the ability of parole, who heard a dog speak to him and tell him who to kill, and went to prison for I don't know how many consecutive life sentences. And in prison, he finds the Lord. He studies the scriptures. He becomes an ordained minister. He doesn't do it because of going to a parole board, so it's not a cheap salvation for the purpose of parole. He knows he can't get out, but he has now devoted his life as a Jewish believer to bringing prisoners to faith in Jesus, because he's seen the transforming power of a man who was demonically possessed, who would tell you he was demonically possessed. He heard dogs tell him verbally, this is your next victim, and he would kill that person. And yet his story, his life story, is one of redemption. And here is this Jewish believer in Sing Sing, in Austin, New York, who is going to be there for the rest of his life. He will die behind bars, but he believes that he has been called by God now to be a minister of the gospel. He's found faith. The psychiatrists have pronounced him completely sane. They say that this is not another delusion. He's been through every kind of possible test to confirm that this is not something that is artificially inseminated. He's gone from hearing dogs to now hearing from an invisible God. And have verified this incredible transformation in the life of Son of Sam, the man who killed people because a dog spoke to him. So we see this, that God is the God who is the God of redemption, the God of second chances, 1,000 chances, the one who takes us out of darkness and brings us into light. How does shame impact our ability to have good relationships? Because I know, to be honest with you, I've had a life that has not been successful in the area of relationships. I've experienced great betrayal. I've made my own mistakes and take ownership of my own mistakes. But I think in the early years, they were shame driven. I was on the run. I ran from what I had done or what I had gotten myself into, and it was out of shame that brought destruction to that. I can go back over 40 years and talk about that and take ownership of it. I wasn't a believer at the time, but doesn't excuse or it doesn't amplify or excuse it. It just gives you the kind of the framework. But I saw it in my own life in retrospect and through study and through counseling. But how does shame impact our ability to have good relationships?
Well, it very negatively affects our relationships. Shame is the painful feeling that I am defective and that I'm worthless. And that is such a painful feeling, I don't want to even admit it. So it goes typically two ways. It'll go out or it'll go in. It goes outward in some kind of narcissistic anger and blame. So I'll need to blame you, attack you, criticize you, demean you, because I feel so bad about myself and I don't want to admit that. I can't tolerate that feeling. So I go outward, and that's very destructive. The narcissistic, rageful, blaming, shaming attack of others, of course, is very destructive in relationships. Or it can go inward, where I feel so defective and unworthy that I withdraw into myself, or maybe I turn to addictions to try to self-medicate myself, or I become depressed or suicidal, or my anxiety becomes something that terrorizes me, so I have panic attacks. It can go in, and that disconnects me from people. So basically, shame, the net effect of chronic, ongoing shame, is that it disconnects us from relationships, either by the outward critical, angry, condemning voice that we direct towards other people, or that same voice directed inwardly, where we then withdraw and isolate and disconnect from other people. It leads to, as I said, things like addictions. I mean, I've worked with many addicts, and true addicts are willing to lie, cheat, and steal in order to support their addiction. They act very immorally, true addicts, to support their addiction. They're so caught up in it. And every addict I've worked with feels ashamed because they act that way. And so at the core of that addiction, there are deep feelings of shame because I'm violating my very created purpose. My ontological purpose in life is to have joyful relationship with God and others. That's why I'm here, is to be connected to Him in a loving relationship and connected to the people around me who are image bearers of Him. And if I'm violating that very reason for being, then I have doubts about my very worth. So people do all kinds of things that are destructive to relationships. Suicidal ideation is common, self-mutilation, people who attempt to hurt themselves. When it goes inward, it's destructive on all kinds of levels. So yes, it's very toxic to relationships. The narcissistic, I have a whole chapter on narcissism. Let's say a bit about that. We typically think of narcissistic people as shameless, because they do whatever they want. They believe in themselves to such a great degree. We would say they have an overestimation of their worth, is what we say of narcissistic people. But what we know now is that that's not true. We know now that the underbelly of narcissism is shame. That why would someone need to be arrogant? Why would someone need to put other people down? Why would someone need to do things that are actually destructive to relationship? There's only one reason for that, and that's because of the doubts about their own worth that they're trying to run from and hide from. And until the narcissistic person faces their own shame, they're caught up in this facade, this masquerading line of behavior that only hurts relationships and never solves their problem, which is a deeper feeling of shame that they can't even admit to themselves. So the healing of narcissism is extremely difficult. We thought up until just a couple of decades ago that the narcissistic personality disorder was untreatable in psychoanalysis. There were a couple of conditions that psychoanalysts would say, we can't treat that. And it's because they couldn't get to the core of their own problem. They're always blaming everybody else for their inadequacies, when really it's their own shame that's the issue. We now know that we can deal with that in therapy, but we have to come at it a different way to help them get to the core of their shame in order to heal even the narcissistic personality disorder. It is treatable, but it's extremely difficult because they seek to hide their shame.
Do men and women handle shame differently?
They do. They both feel it. We know that women are willing to admit it more than men. We have a very hard time as men admitting to the feeling of shame. Women are much more likely to say, oh, yes, no, I feel that. I feel inadequate. I compare myself to other women, and I feel like I'm not as pretty. Sadly, after all the feminist and Me Too movements and all the awareness in our society today, the number one reason women feel shame today is not feeling physically attractive enough. So that's still the core of their battle. They also are afraid that they're not a good enough mother. That's the second source of shame for women. Men do feel shame, but it's very hard for us to admit it. We try to disguise it. So what we'll do is talk about the good old days. We'll talk about the glory days. We'll have a hyper sense of macho sexuality. We'll be homophobic. We'll try to hide any doubts that we might have about ourselves in the belief that we can overperform as a man, and yet underneath that, for men too, we have doubts about our own worth. It's just much more difficult for us to talk about it. And I have found in many churches, I have found that a powerful place for healing shame is a small men's group where men can be vulnerable with other men and feel accepted, where they experience the grace of God with other men in a way that's powerfully healing for them, that they cannot admit to their own wives. These vulnerable feelings of self-doubt, because they believe their wives expect them to not have any feelings of self-doubt. There are things men can do to heal their shame that are powerful, and I believe in the power of men's groups, small men's groups, where men can be honest with each other and bring their shame out and find, as they look across the group in the eyes of another man, and find the grace of God being communicated back to them. Powerfully healing, powerfully healing.
So in these last 5 minutes that we have, walk me through some of the steps in how we can overcome shame.
Well, the three things I really want to drill down and say, you've got to grasp these three things to heal shame: are courage, vulnerability, and grace. Those are the three things. There's a lot now being published in the area of vulnerability. A lot of research is being done. Brene Brown has written 3 bestsellers in this area, but she doesn't go quite far enough, because just being vulnerable alone is not enough to heal your shame, because you can be vulnerable with the wrong person and be shamed. So you have to have the courage to admit that you feel it, the vulnerability to confess it to another, because you can't think your way out of it, you cannot reason your way out of it, and then you need the experience of grace. That's what changes the experience of shame. Shame is a feeling and an unconscious belief that you're not worthy of love. And what changes that experience in your heart is experiencing love in the midst of your vulnerability. So I confess, I admit that I have shame. I confess it to a trusted confidant. You have to choose your confidants wisely, and then experience that acceptance with God, or with like I said, the men's group, or other believers who can come alongside you in a gracious way. And then you have to keep experiencing that. I know, and I know you do too, I know people who've experienced an authentic conversion. They've come to Christ, they've been healed of their shame, they've changed, and then they didn't enter into an ongoing fellowship. They didn't surround themselves in grace-filled relationships. And over the years, we end up saying, well, where did he go? Where's Bob today? Where is Bob? You know, it's been 4 or 5 years since I've seen him. Falls out of fellowship. He falls out of the ongoing, renewing relationships that are grace-filled relationships. The shame comes back. And I believe he's still a believer, but the bad behaviors creep back in, the addictions, maybe the anger outbursts and stuff, that the toxic behaviors that are rooted in shame come back, because you have to keep living in ongoing grace-filled relationships with God and others to keep renewing your mind and keep healing the shame in an ongoing process. We don't get done in life. We just enter into the process of healing.
Counseling, of course, is an important component to all of this. Having a safe having a safe person. This is a discussion I had with Dr. Ramona Probasco about abuse, of having a safe person to be able to have accountability partners and a trusted small group of people that you can be open with. But it does need to be guided, led, and directed by a professional counselor that can help you identify some of these core issues. And that requires a certain amount of honesty and transparency and a desire to find wholeness. We're not talking about healthiness. We're talking about wholeness. And wholeness is different than healthiness. Wholeness is something that comes from a relationship where it's you and God, and that's what makes you whole. And that is, of course, the core of holiness. And that is what we're striving for, is this holiness in this relationship with God, not trying to fill a hole with all these other things. And so, Dr. Baker, again, I commend you for taking on a subject that is not written a lot about, but yet it is of epidemic proportion. There are so many, and it manifests in these very difficult marriages, these broken homes, these fatherless homes, that people have, because of what they've done or they perceive that they have done, which is unworthy of ever being forgiven, that they steep themselves in shame, and they respond and they react and they don't have control. And this is a deliverance of a kind that says you can be delivered of shame and you can live not a shameless life, but you don't have to live a shameful life. And
Amen.
that is the difference in your approach to all of this. Thank you
Amen.
for taking time to visit with us for a second part on this very, very important subject. And I encourage everybody to get a copy of Overcoming Shame. Let go of others' expectations and embrace God's acceptance. He loves you. He wants you to feel worthy of His love. Yes, He lays out all the things that you are not, but when He does that, He's trying to tell you that you may be not, but He is. And you plus God fix all of these issues. And Dr. Baker, you have been just a gem and a pleasure, and I count you among friends and family of this program.
Thank you. It's my honor to be with you. God bless you and your ministry.
Thank you so much, and you as well. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.